Daniel Goh is Associate Professor at the Department of Sociology in NUS. In his research, Daniel has critically examined the topic of race and cultural diversity in Singapore. Let us welcome Dr. Daniel Goh, who is our keynote speaker.
Thank you, everyone. When I first accepted the invitation for giving this talk, I told Constance I'm not sure what I deserve. What did I do to deserve this this honor? Because I don't see myself as an advocate in any way. The last time I was involved in civil society was back in 1999 when I was in Nature Society, and we led a youth wing at the time, and it's called Jalan Hijau, and we went against the dolphin exhibition at Sentosa, which finally is going away, right? So it took about 12 years, or more than that actually, 17 years of our advocacy to drive not the dolphins away, but to drive the exhibition away. The dolphin sadly is going to go to a Chinese theme park near Macau, so it's not good news. But in any case, that was a long time ago when I participated in civil society, and now I'm more an academic plus a political activist. If those of you who didn't know, in the Workers' Party, but that's not my identity today. So don't ask me anything about politics. This is a completely academic talk, sort of. It's based on my research into state formation, into the history of state formation. And a kind of offshoot into the study of multiculturalism and multiracialism in Singapore and Malaya and Malaysia. All right. So my talk today is going to focus on these three ideas. All right, multiracialism, multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism. And what I'm going to do is these three key ideas which engage diversity in Singapore. I'm going to go very quickly through the historical origins and the context which led them to become key ideas that become the focus for policy making by the state, and also as kind of register for discourse in civil society or in larger society. When people talk about what is culture, they go back to these three ideas, all right, of multiracialism, multiculturalism, and cosmopolitanism. Institutional underpinnings, right, mostly by the formed by the state, all right, with collaboration with parts of society, and then the strengths and weaknesses, and this is. And the fourth one is unconscious problem, which is the more interesting part actually, all right, which is kind of the hidden issue that is underlying the different institutions and the different ideas that are flowing around and the discourse that's going around. And then I'm going to end with a discussion about the new Singaporean that's being formed by these three ideas and all the institutions that surround it. All right, and I'll give a very quick and brief, and maybe that may be the most interesting part actually, a brief kind of comparison to Hong Kong. I've been doing some research in Hong Kong, and I'm going to look at some cultural activism in Hong Kong. I'm going to do a bit of comparison to show perhaps what is lacking in Singapore. All right, multiracialism, origins. All right, the origins really is in colonialism, right, in which a plural society is said to be formed. One of the things that we often don't quite think of when we talk about colonialism is how colonial states, colonial governments, when they come in, they're actually pretty clueless, all right, about the population. Right? A lot of these bureaucrats would have studied in Oxford, Cambridge, or Edinburgh, or one of these universities. They come over as bureaucrats, they're employed, and what they do actually is they become part-time anthropologists or ethnographers, right? And they will start to try to study the local society, right? The Chinese society, the Malay societies, the Indians, and so on and so forth. And what they did was actually to produce a certain body of knowledge that has become the basis for policy making during the colonial period. And one of these officials, not in Singapore but in Burma, J.F. Feniver, right? He went there as a colonial official, and then he went back and became an academic. And he came up with this concept, plural society, to try to understand how colonial society is structured, all right, how they are formed. Because of the diversity, because of the kind of super diversity, which is a more modern concept, but it can be used then, a kind of super diversity that's being brought about by migration. You have different communities, different ethnic communities, right? They are formed that interact a lot in the marketplace, right, with economic transactions, but they do not have a kind of political identity in which to form a nation or a proto-nation. All right, so that's the idea here of a plural society. All right, they mix, but they do not combine. All right, and because they don't combine, it poses political problems. And Furnival was writing in a period of decolonization, where he, as a liberal, right, wanted to see the third world nations come about and become independent and become viable nations. So he theorized plural society not as a way to kind of to perpetuate imperialism or the empire, but he did it as a kind of liberal to want to pose the problem of nationalism, so that more liberal colonial governments that are preparing for decolonization could help local societies to become the nations that they should become, right? But one could also then detect a certain divide and rule, right, notion of divide and rule here, in a sense that once colonial governments see the society as made up of different segments that do not combine, right, they can also then manipulate that kind of knowledge, right, to make sure that the local population stays divided, so that the imperial governments can continue to rule over the natives. One of these tactics or epistemic, right, knowledge-based kind of tactics that were used by the British was to divide the population, right, into 4 general categories: Chinese, Malay, Indian, others, CMIO, right, or in Malaysia, MCIO, right, and form a series of racial stereotypes that are attached to it. This did not come out naturally. It came out through a series of construction, through census, through demographic kind of studies and ethnographic kind of studies, in which then, by the time of the Second World War in the 1930s, where Malaya was faced with labor strikes and all kinds of labor unionizations and nationalist organizations, the British were very consciously starting to use CMIO as a way to divide the population and to maintain their rule. All right. Now, in the aftermath of the Second World War, where decolonization began to happen, more liberal kind of officials then started to use CMIO as the basis for bringing the population together. All right, so CMIO is not necessarily the bad thing in per se. It's a framework that they are using, both to divide, but also to use to combine. Right? And of course, when the colonial government, when they do decolonization, they were trying to combine the CMIO in such a way as to go against the communists, right? To create a non-communist entity. Right? Now, there were a lot of racial stereotypes that were attached to this. So, for example, in the 1920s, stereotypes were being formed about Malays, all right, as Malays as lazy, unable to perform economically, all right, and they tend to be so rooted to the soil and to the weather and the beautiful tropics that they tend not to want to work, all right, and so they were very often deprived of resources to be able to go into the labor sector. All right, and also at the same time deprived of subsidies when it comes to cash crop plantations, which kept them out of the cash crop economy. So rubber plantations and other kind of palm plantations and so on and so forth. A lot of Malay farmers are actually very entrepreneurial in Malaya. They planted rubber next to their rice crops and whatnot. But the British government then used the stereotypes to formulate the policy to remove those rubber trees as much as possible from their plantations, so as to keep the rubber plantations within the control of the European plantations. So these are the kind of racial stereotypes that were used explicitly, all right, in policy formation. All right, okay, so that created economic divisions too, all right, separating the different populations. One of the things they did was to try to separate the Malays and the Chinese as much as possible, because the Chinese often were trading middlemen, and the Malay planters would sell rice to them. Right, the colonial government tried to come in to break that relationship because they don't want to. They thought the Chinese were greedy, and that's the racial stereotype, right? Greedy, they will steal things, they will cheat you if possible. So they are basically cheating the Malays, and we had to come in to save the Malays from the Chinese. So that was the kind of stereotyping that was being done. All right, and of course then political segregation. All right, Chinese are not sons of the soil; they are not Bumiputra. They are migrants, and they should stay as migrants, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that the kind of political segregation was in place. So multiracialism as an idea basically came about as a kind of nationalist response, all right, to plural society and to the kind of colonial divide and rule. And the approach is to accept the entrenched racial sentiments, entrenched by colonialism, and the political interests of the different groups that have already been set up by the colonial framework, all right? But, all right, then there is a but here because it's a nationalist enterprise after all, that these different races, although separated by the colonial framework and separated by racial sentiments, could and should band together in solidarity and eventually overcome the CMIO framework a long way into the future, all right? And to build, therefore, a nation with a common purpose, all right? So the CMIO will come together, rather than being separated, will come together to form a nation, all right? So that was the kind of social compact that was underlying both Malaysia and Singapore, although the quarrels between Lee Kuan Yew and Tunku Abdul Rahman over the separation, over merger and over separation, was partly due to the differences in how do you combine, right, with as a nation with a common purpose. Though it was there, the differences, the ultimate fundamental linkage between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore at the time was the belief that there should be a common nation with the four races combined together in some way or another, right, building a nation with a common purpose, right? Okay, so what are the institutions that were left in Singapore after separation, right? And they were all set up, some of them were set up before separation, the others after separation and into nation building. So these are the different institutions, and most of you will be familiar with them, right? The Presidential Council for Minority Rights, all right? Then bilingualism, all right, as an institution. Group Representation Constituency, which came about in the 1980s. Ethnic self-help groups, ethnic integration policy. Now, some of you might be a bit cynical and say, hey, these are actually political maneuvers by the PAP to stay in power. That could be true, right? But at least in terms of policy intent, all right, and what the political leaders say and justify, and the justification accepted by the majority of the population, no matter what, is that it is based on multiracialism, right? And there is very strong justification for it, right? In a sense of legitimacy given by the common folks, right? Okay, so what are its strengths and weaknesses? Well, it acknowledges and reinforces racial identities. So it is pragmatic, but at the same time, it is self-fulfilling, right? It perpetuates the categories, right? Although it is very pragmatic, because you can't ignore these racial sentiments, it does reinforce and perpetuate it at some level. All right? It produces national identity for a plural society and migrant city. It worked really quite well in the 1970s and 1980s in Singapore. All right? But, of course, the self-fulfilling thing, right, is that the racial sentiments remain. The other major problem is that the CMIO grid is very rigid, right? So much so that the government itself is having problems dealing with offsprings, right, children of biracial marriages. How do we categorize them? And how do they categorize themselves vis-a-vis the administrative apparatus? Xenophobia, very interestingly in Singapore, is also mapped, right, by the grid. So that you see that the Chinese are rejecting Chinese migrants, right, as Chinese, saying that we are a different kind of Chinese. So even the CMIO grid is mapped onto xenophobia. And it's that powerful in a sense, or as a framework to be used. Okay, so this is the unconscious problem, the grid, right, the curse of the Singapore grid. This is actually Imran's annotated map. I took it from one of the blogs. And it shows the kind of urban planning in early Singapore in 1822, where the very strong separation, right, that was being enforced by the urban planners, although the enforcement was not on the ground, was not as harsh as envisaged in the map, right? At least in terms of the mapping, all right, the framework that was used was the separation of the different kampongs and the different ethnic communities, that they should be living separately, all right, in different parts of town, all right, separated by different amenities, by the river, by parks, and so on and so forth. The comparison is to Georgetown and Penang, where you see actually the different races, different ethnic groups. And it's hard to categorize them into CMIO very often, lumped together in a very tight density and often forming defensive structures that are linked to each other. All right, so in 1867, there was a major riot in Penang in which you have basically two groups fighting each other. And the Europeans were actually excluded from the fight, but they panicked, of course, seeing the natives going at each other. And this is an example of what happened in a Penang kind of trans-ethnic or trans-cultural solidarity, in which you have Chinese, Malays, and Indians allying with each other against another group that's consisting of Chinese, Malay, and Indians. Secret societies on both sides, right? So it's a very multiracial kind of war that's going on, right? In which both sides is not based on color lines, it's not based on racial lines, right? It's based on economic lines and alliances. And basically, the whole of Georgetown was rioting, and there was a civil war that was going on. And the British colonial government, which Strait Settlements was set up in 1867, basically panicked right? And they basically then use Singapore's grid as a kind of model to try to impose some kind of order and to separate the races as much as possible, because they saw how powerful it is when the different races actually can gang up with each other, right, against another entity, all right? So the kind of transethnic solidarity is present in Penang, but we have a curse here because the Singapore grid is very much separated from CMIO, right? It's not the kind of Penang, Georgetown grid where hybridity and blendedness and transethnic alliances are the norms. Okay, multiculturalism, the origins. Now, this happened in the 1980s. Okay, most of you will be familiar in the sense that you kind of grew up in this era. All right, concerns about deracination, right? Losing your essential cultural identity, your essence, the loss of heritage, and a lot of sociologists were providing information and intelligence for the state then. All right, and so you see actually a lot of sociological concepts going into the state's knowledge apparatus. Right, the state became Weberian, trying to go into religious knowledge to try to encourage the Protestant ethic, right, among the population. Right, the state was also going Durkheimian, trying to promote national values and Asian values as a kind of moral framework, all right, to bring society together, because deviance and crime rates were going up and all kinds of divorce rates were going. They basically saw solidarity was breaking down, and so the best thing to do was to bring values back in. And this is a very Durkheimian thing for those of you who know sociology. They were also going Paul Gilroy, a British sociologist, who saw modernity as a white problem basically, and the kind of suppression of history, right, of coloured history, as a problem in modernity. So Gilroy proposed a kind of counterculture of modernity in which you look at the Black Atlantic. You don't see the Atlantic as a white Atlantic, but you see it as a Black Atlantic, where slavery and the Black heritage, right, becomes important and key in the formation of identity for the Atlantic and for people across the Atlantic. Right? But in Singapore, the appropriation is by the state rather than by civil society, of course, right? In which history and his heritage become very key, important objects of study and also policy making. And so National Heritage Board and all the different heritage institutions were starting to get going in the 80s and 90s, right, in this time, so as to go against a modernity that will remove our cultural identity, okay, to prevent us from becoming westernized. All right, so as an idea, in Singapore, multiculturalism is about how cultural practices of the groups are constantly evolving, that individuals should cross the boundary to participate, and to adapt and adopt these practices as hybrid practices. And hawker centers are often used as a kind of real-life example and also symbolic marker, right, of hybridity. And the idea is to construct our shared heritage. Now, the word hybridity actually makes its appearance in state documents in Singapore in policy making in the early 2000s. Right? It's a concept that came up with Homi Bhabha, a British, not British, I don't know why, he's a diasporic Indian who is teaching in the US. He came up with this term hybridity and became a really famous concept that was being used by cultural theorists. It took about 10 years for the concept to go into the government apparatus here in Singapore. All right, and when it got in, basically it was then being used to promote a kind of shared heritage, right? Being used that promote it as a basis for the Singaporean identity. You want to be multicultural, you want to be Singaporean, you have to be multicultural, and to be multicultural, you have to hybridize. Right? You can't just stay as Chinese or Malay or Indian. You have to learn about each other's culture, and you have to go and eat each other's food, and you have to start to hybridize and become Singaporean, therefore. Institutions, the National Heritage Board, okay, with the different museums and different centers, the formation of heritage towns and nodes, all right, like Joo Chiat, all right, it's Peranakan town, People's Association promoting all kinds of heritage activities and not just as a place for teaching cooking or watching TV, all right, but having heritage programs. Racial Harmony Day was set up as an educational programming, all right, for kids. Festivals and Heritage Fest that was organized every year around the Racial Harmony Day period, all right? So these are all the different institutions that have been set up to promote multiculturalism. So what are the strengths and weaknesses? Well, it opens up spaces for cultural agency, right? Allows for citizens to actually enter that space and argue for their heritage to be preserved, to argue for certain things to be conserved, for certain ideas to be promoted, and so on and so forth. So it does open up the cultural space. But it is very often consumption-oriented and non-dialogic, all right, in a sense that it is about consuming the heritage, right, enjoying the heritage, but not really about the dialogue about, what is wrong with your heritage or what is wrong with my heritage, what is right about it, and what should we hybridize, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't really involve a lot of interaction or dialogue. It just involves consumption, right? There's a lot of co-optation of memory and also depoliticization of history, right? In a sense that if there are political nastiness, right, that's involved in certain events, these are as much as possible suppressed and hidden away from view, right? And the promotion of nostalgia, right, is prevalent here, in which there is a certain sinister side to it in the sense that it allows for the urban planners to continually develop Singapore, right, by saying that, hey, look, development is inevitable. So let's just celebrate the loss, let's capture the memories, right, put them in exhibitions and enjoy and consume the memories, right? But we have to tear down this building, right? We can't help it, right? So there is a certain inevitability and certain fatalism, right, that's been promoted by this multiculturalism. So what is the unconscious here? The goals of 1964, which is often used to promote or to justify, not to promote, but to justify the kind of multiculturalism, the ideas and the institutions, including Racial Harmony Day, which is the 21st of July, to commemorate the 1964 riots. But the problem here is that very little is known, and let me qualify that because PJ is in the audience, and very little is known among the population, among the intellectuals in Singapore, among the intelligentsia, all right, the educated folks and so forth, among the students, about 1964 riots. There's a standard narrative that's being repeated, and there's very little that we know actually of what happened, who are the protagonists, where it happened, why it happened, and so on and so forth. One of the things that came up in the 1970s very, very briefly, and then it died down, was a certain explanation in which is very interesting because it ties back to the transcultural and transethnic solidarity that I mentioned earlier, which is that the riots took place in Kallang Geylang, which is a Malay-Chinese town, in which the Malays in their kampongs and doing plantations and doing planting relied on the Chinese middlemen in the town to provide services and to trade, all right, the goods. This relationship was breaking down with modernization and urbanization. So a lot of the kampongs were being relocated into Geylang Serai flats. The market was being refurbished and reorganized and so on and so forth. So urban development was breaking down that symbiotic economic relationship between Malays and Chinese. Right? Then coupled with the politics of merger, right, and the quarrel between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, the situation was basically combustible. Right? So that's why it happened in Kallang and Geylang. So the breakdown in economic symbiosis was also crucial. Right? So symbiotic urban economies, cultural hybridity, social unity, these are the things that were kind of, we don't know much about it. Right? We should try to discover or rediscover in the context of 1964 riots what happened in Geylang and Kallang. Was there a breakdown? What happened to the cultural hybridity that was going on there? Because the Chinese would come out during the Prophet Muhammad procession to celebrate together with the Malays, and that's why you have Chinese there, right, to riot with in the procession. The breakdown, right, the political crisis, and then now the kind of nostalgic consumption that we have that's linked to the Racial Harmony Day, that's linked to 1964 riots, and the hypersensitivity that we have with it, as we don't talk about, what actually happened and why it happened. Okay, cosmopolitanism, the origins, right, concerns about Singaporeans and globalization, and the call to be both cosmopolitan and heartlander. And there's a certain kind of dual mobility that's going on, right? We want to be a global city, but we want the majority of the population is still in the HDB estate. All right, we want you to be both cosmopolitan and yet rooted in the heartland. All right, and a lot of this is linked to welcoming businesses and new immigrants, right? Which started peaking in the late 2000s. What is the idea here? We are all citizens of a city with an open economy. We can comfortably embrace and travel the world, and we can compete with the best, and we remain rooted in the values of home and family. All right. So this idea is kind of guiding a lot of the refurbishment of the urban center, right, civic center, including the National Gallery and the City Hall, the Old City Hall and Supreme Court, right, in which one has a viewing gallery, right, to look at the cosmopolitan global city while being rooted in the heartland values of Southeast Asia art and Singaporean art. All right. So what are the institutions? Civic District Redevelopment, right? The Esplanade, Singapore Art Museum, National Gallery, the Singapore Biennale 2000, using art, all right, as a basis for rooting you. F1 Night Race, Chingay Parade, all these things are institutions that kind of try to combine both cosmopolitanism in the sense of being cosmopolitan and heartland. So Chingay, for example, happens in the city center, but there are also Chingay parades in the heartland, right? Through Toa Payoh and Bishan, this year, I think, yeah. And all these things are supposed to kind of tie everybody up together, right? In both a kind of global city plus heartland kind of utopia, right? Strengths and weaknesses, openness, worlding possibilities, but at the same time, it kind of use carnivalesque kind of consumption celebration, right, to hide the class relations, all right, the class divide that is opening up because of globalization, of unequalness. One of the Chingay, a blog that I looked at for Chingay Parade, and the participant from a heartland, right, was saying that, hey, I'm so glad I participate in this year's Chingay Parade. I'm acting as an ant, all right, in a float, in which the whole idea here is that there's a butterfly that becomes, there's a caterpillar that becomes a butterfly, symbolizing Singapore becoming a global city, right? And I'm an ant in the whole act, right, of the float. And I'm so happy to be there. But I'm just an ant, and I'll never be a butterfly in this garden global city. But it's okay. I'm happy because I'm a heartland who can still participate in the Chingay Parade. So there's a certain kind of, there's a certain kind of fatalism that's also attached to this picture. All right. The unconscious, we have a Gestalt problem. All right. We have a lot of fragments today. All right, and the Singapore Memory Project is in a way exemplifying that. A lot of fragments, a lot of memories all over the place. But we have we seem to have lost a certain ability to imagine the whole that's separated from the fragments. That's made out of the fragments, but it's not, right, just a collection of the fragments, right? The Singapore Memory Project brought a lot of fragments of nostalgic kind of elements into the picture for SG50, but we do not know how to make sense of it. In fact, we have a problem because we have lost the ability to make sense of our nation as a whole, right, as an entity, right? We used to have an imagination of a community of peers, but I think we have lost it, and now we have kind of decentered images of selves, right, with a lot of nostalgic memories that we do not know how to then speak to each other as Singaporeans anymore, right? We have lost that sense, right, of the language and the ability to think of ourselves as Singapore. That's just more than, much more, right, than just the memory fragments that we have. So what do we have here? The new Singaporean, right? Multiracialism being caught between nationalism and xenophobia, multiculturalism being caught between hybridity and nostalgia, cosmopolitanism being caught between worlding, kind of openness, and then Malays, right, kind of tiredness and sianness, right, the perfect word for describing that. The new Singaporean is kind of caught between all these kind of contradictions, all right, and haunted by the grid, by the ghost, by the Gestalt problem, and it comes out in many ways, right, in kind of cultural activism that we see in the kind of cultural wars, in which everyone is almost an cultural activist today in Singapore, using Facebook and social media, right? All fighting all kind of cultural wars that either is pro-gay versus pro-family or whatever they want to call it, right? All kinds of cultural activism that's going on. Identity politics is on a high, all right? And there's a culture of outrage. Everyone is being outraged by each other, offended by each other. They're basically refusing to talk to each other, right? Every time someone utters something, you will definitely offend someone. All right, and then they won't be talking to each other because the person will be shouting, "I'm offended," right? I'm going to make a police report, all right? And then once that fellow make a police report, then I'm offended, I'll make a police report against you, and so it becomes like that, right? A kind of culture of outrage. Now, what is the alternative? I look to Hong Kong as a counterexample, and I've been researching this particular group that's made up of cultural activists, and their idea of cultural activism is very interesting and different. This is more about grassroots politics and the politics and the cultural emplacement and empowerment. It's based in To Kwa Wan, or the Bay of Ground Melons near the old Kai Tak Airport. All right, and it's a rundown place, all right, rundown in the kind of Singaporean sense or Hong Kong sense, in which we expect modern buildings and so on and so forth. But the people there are very rooted to the ground. But urban redevelopment is coming in with the MTR, all right, station. And the property magnates are coming in to try to buy up properties and to redevelop the place. So the cultural activists came in to set up a shop front, all right, and to begin to create cultural consciousness among the local residents, begin to organize cultural mapping, begin to organize maps, mapping exhibitions, and also art and craft exhibitions to try to kind of ground their local sentiments and to ground their local culture and to make them become more aware of the heritage they have. all right? And they set up shop here, and it becomes a community center that's completely privately funded. I mean, it's a social concern rather than a state-funded enterprise, all right? And this is one of the, this is again the shop front, all right? One of the days where they were having a cultural mapping presentation, right, to the residents in the area. So it's this kind of grounded cultural activism that is kind of lacking, I think, in Singapore, right? And because a lot of the words history, heritage, even grassroots, they're all monopolized by the state, right? And when civil society comes in, it doesn't quite does this kind of advocacy or activism, right? In which one tries to go back to the more grounded kind of cultural consciousness raising among the people, right? Making them aware of culture, what is culture, and getting them to map their own culture and then to basically to own their own culture and to empower them, all right? So this is kind of lacking because in civil society, we are kind of limited in terms of discourse and maybe also in terms of ideas, in that we try to advocate, we advocate vis-a-vis the state. We are very state-oriented, right? All of us are very state-oriented, including academics. We kind of forget the grassroots, in the realm of grassroots, and the grassroots politics. And I think if there's anything that we should try to improve on and should go in that direction, is this kind of grassroots advocacy, this kind of grassroots politics, empowerment and emplacement, in which we work with local residents on the ground to try to get them to be sensitized to culture. And it's not that they don't have culture, they have very rich culture. It's a question of getting them becoming more reflexive and to begin to use their own culture as empowerment weapons for themselves to defend whatever interests they have. Right? Thank you.